Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, not to a grand battlefield or a royal court, but to a sleepy little town where the greatest threat wasn't an invading army, but something far more feathery. Imagine, if you will, the gentle patter of rain against your window, a cozy blanket tucked around you, and then, suddenly, a relentless tapping. They chirped in the mornings, they nested in the trees, they ate their fill of stray crumbs and garden grubs, and generally kept to themselves. A bit like declaring war on a particularly stubborn patch of weeds, or perhaps a strong gust of wind. It wasn't a king, but rather Mayor Reginald Bumble, a man whose most significant accomplishment to date had been successfully organizing the annual Fotheringay-on-Wye Turnip Festival. Some suggested stricter scarecrows, others, more aggressively, proposed slingshots. One particularly imaginative fellow, old Farmer Giles, even mumbled something about training a badger. The problem, as you might already be sensing, wasn't just the sheer number of birds. Not your garden variety straw figures, mind you, but grand, intimidating effigies designed to strike fear into the very hearts of the feathered invaders. First, it was a single, bold sparrow, landing on a scarecrow's outstretched arm, seemingly assessing its threat level. Then another, and another, until the scarecrows, once symbols of defiance, became nothing more than convenient perching posts. You'd see them, these valiant straw figures, adorned with garlands of chirping, preening birds, as if they were feathered Christmas trees. It was a rather undignified end for their grand plans, and certainly a morale-sapping sight for the human residents. One old woman, Mrs. Gable, swore she saw a particularly plump pigeon building a nest in the sleeve of a scarecrow that resembled her late husband. The cheek of it, she'd declare, shaking her fist at the sky. Such was the peculiar nature of this conflict. It wasn't just about winning. It was about maintaining a shred of dignity in the face of relentless, feathered impudence. The town's initial, rather optimistic, attempts at bird deterrence were clearly just the opening skirmish. Farmers, usually a practical lot, got surprisingly artistic. There were scarecrows dressed as knights, scarecrows with elaborate tin can armor that jingled ominously in the breeze, and even one particularly ambitious scarecrow designed to resemble Mayor Bumble himself, complete with spectacles and a stern expression. You can almost picture it, can't you? A field full of these silent, motionless guardians, standing sentinel against the dawn. And for a brief, glorious moment, it seemed to work. The birds, perhaps startled by the sudden appearance of these bizarre figures, kept a respectful distance, but their apparent intelligence, or at least their uncanny knack for adapting to every human countermeasure. This wasn't just a flock of dim-witted fowl. These were birds with a purpose, a collective avian ambition that seemed to revolve around making life in Fotheringay-on-Wye as uncomfortable as possible. Historians still argue whether this was a true, organized intelligence or merely a remarkable convergence of instinct and opportunity. But to the beleaguered residents, it certainly felt like a coordinated attack. Who found himself thrust into the unenviable position of leading the charge against the feathered hordes. No longer would their antics be dismissed as mere nuisances. They were officially an enemy combatant. Bounties were placed on sparrowheads, a rather gruesome thought perhaps, but desperate times, you see. Children, usually tasked with chores, like fetching water or shooing away stray chickens, were now deputized as junior bird chasers, armed with clappers and loud voices. It was a charmingly amateurish effort, really, like trying to empty a bathtub with a teaspoon while the tap is still running at full blast. You could almost hear the collective avian chuckle from the rooftops. Imagine him, spectacles perched precariously on his nose, standing before a bewildered town council, a stray pigeon perched impudently on the window ledge just behind his head, seemingly mocking his very words. He presented a grim report: crops ravaged, market stalls plundered, and worst of all, the relentless sanity-testing cacophony from dawn till dusk. "Gentlemen," he declared, pushing his spectacles up his nose, a heroic glint in his eye that perhaps only he could see, "we are under siege. A feathered menace threatens our very way of life, our livelihoods, and our precious slumber." But for the residents of Fotheringay-on-Wye, it was no laughing matter. This wasn't just a nuisance, it was an invasion, a relentless siege on their sanity and, more importantly, their precious sleep. The chirping turned into squawking, the gentle pecking into aggressive scavenging. Your freshly laundered linens, hung out to dry, would return with mysterious, speckled patterns. Your carefully tended gardens became avian cafeterias, stripped bare overnight. And the noise. Imagine trying to read your evening paper or enjoy a quiet cup of tea with the constant, irritating backdrop of 1,000 tiny arguments happening just outside your window. It was enough to drive even the most placid individual to distraction, and the residents of Fotheringay-on-Wye were, shall we say, reaching their distraction limit. This wasn't just about crumbs and gardens anymore. It was about the very fabric of their tranquil existence being pecked and torn apart, one feather at a time. The tipping point was nigh. A pleasant background hummed to the gentle rhythm of town life. Nobody gave them a second thought beyond perhaps admiring a robin's song or shooing a pigeon from a windowsill. But something shifted. Historians still argue whether it was a particularly harsh winter that drove them closer to human habitation, a sudden boom in their population, or perhaps an especially delicious, yet entirely accidental, offering from a careless baker. But whatever the cause, the birds began to change their habits. They became bolder, more numerous, and significantly more demanding. It started subtly, a few more sparrows than usual, pecking at discarded crusts in the market square. Then came the starlings, arriving in vast, murmuring clouds that blotted out the midday sun, their collective chattering a low, unsettling rumble. And finally, the pigeons. Oh, the pigeons. They, more than any other, would become the town's most persistent, and frankly, most impudent adversaries. Not a polite knock, mind you, but an insistent, almost indignant drumming from just outside. Now, picture that sound, not from one source, but from hundreds, thousands, a veritable cacophony of tiny claws and beaks. You close your eyes, hoping for quiet, but the sound persists. An avian symphony of chaos that seems designed specifically to keep you from that peaceful slumber you crave. This isn't a nightmare. It was, for one unfortunate town, a very real, very noisy, and very persistent problem. You might think you could handle a few chirping birds, but trust me, you probably wouldn't survive a day in this particular ornithological nightmare. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins in a place that, for the sake of a soothing narrative, we'll call Fotheringay-on-Wye. It was a quaint, unassuming little settlement, nestled beside a slow-moving river, with rolling green hills and neat rows of cottages. The kind of place you'd imagine for a quiet retirement, or perhaps a particularly boring postcard. Life there moved at a pace that could only be described as glacial, where the most exciting event of the week might be the arrival of the Tuesday mail coach, or perhaps a particularly robust debate about the optimal time to harvest the turnip crop. The good folk of Fotheringay-on-Wye were, by all accounts, simple, peace-loving souls who valued their routines, their tranquility, and, above all else, their unbroken sleep. They weren't prepared for what was coming. They certainly weren't prepared for the sheer, unadulterated audacity of the feathered menace that would soon descend upon them, turning their peaceful existence into a squawking, fluttering battleground. You see, for generations, the birds of Fotheringay-on-Wye had been, well, just birds. You might be wondering, how does a town declare war on birds? It sounds rather quaint, doesn't it? The declaration of war, while perhaps not issued with pomp and circumstance from a gilded throne room, was nonetheless very real. The council, a collection of local merchants, farmers, and a surprisingly agile baker, muttered amongst themselves. The official declaration of war, such as it was, came in the form of a town ordinance. No longer would the birds be tolerated. One of the first significant actions taken by the town was the widespread deployment of the aforementioned scarecrows. But remember that uncanny avian adaptability. It wasn't long before the birds caught on. With the scarecrows turned into glorified bird perches, the citizens of Fotheringay-on-Wye realized they needed to escalate their efforts. The initial skirmishes had been, shall we say, a rude awakening. You might imagine a few chirps here and there, a quick flutter past your ear, but no. We're talking about a relentless, all-encompassing avian presence. They tried everything they could think of, often with hilariously disastrous results. Imagine the poor bell-ringer pulling on those ropes hour after hour, his arms aching, while the birds merely adjusted to the new soundtrack, perhaps even finding it a rather pleasant rhythm for their endless squawking. Firecrackers were tried, then small, harmless cannons designed to emit a loud bang. You see, the problem wasn't just the sheer numbers of birds, but their utter lack of respect for human authority. They perched on lampposts, leaving their distinctive marks. They nested in chimneys, causing smoke to billow back into cozy cottages. Historians still argue whether the birds of Fotheringay-on-Wye exhibited an unusual form of collective intelligence, learning from human mistakes. There was the proposal to import a flock of trained falcons, quickly dismissed when someone pointed out the cost and the distinct possibility of the falcons simply joining the rebellious local birds. Another suggestion involved a town-wide campaign of persistent, low-frequency humming, which, it was theorized, would irritate the birds' delicate auditory senses. This was swiftly vetoed when Mayor Bumble, after a particularly long night, accidentally hummed himself into a profound slumber during a critical budget discussion. The council's exasperation was palpable, turning Fotheringay-on-Wye into a curious laboratory of failed avian deterrence. Each new attempt only serving to highlight the surprising tenacity and resourcefulness of their feathered adversaries. Or if it was merely a classic case of natural selection in action, only the boldest, most cunning birds survived the initial deterrence efforts, passing on their impudent genes. Whatever the case, it certainly felt like they were learning. They seemed to anticipate human movements, dodging thrown stones with casual grace, and even appearing to communicate alarm calls that scattered their flocks, just as a human attempted a stealthy approach. It was enough to make you wonder if they held their own council meetings, perhaps strategizing over purloined crumbs. They even seemed to delight in dive-bombing the heads of unsuspecting villagers, a particularly rude form of aerial harassment. The council, in a moment of exasperated genius, even considered a town-wide ban on birdseed, hoping to starve the feathered invaders out. This, of course, was met with protests from the more compassionate residents, who argued that it was simply cruel, and besides, the birds seemed to be perfectly content feasting on everyone's meticulously planted vegetable patches. You'd hear a sudden boom that would make you jump out of your skin, followed by a moment of eerie silence. The idea, proposed by the town's elderly but surprisingly spry clockmaker, Mr. Tickle, involved rigging tripwires of fine fishing line across key thoroughfares, hoping to snag the birds mid-flight. You can almost picture it, can't you? Tiny, almost invisible lines strung across the market square, gleaming faintly in the sunlight. The thought was that the birds, once ensnared, could then be humanely captured and relocated. A noble, if entirely naive, aspiration. The reality, of course, was that the fishing lines proved far more effective at tripping up unwary pedestrians, leading to a series of spectacular, if harmless, tumbles. Old Mrs. Higgins, known for her prize-winning petunias, took an unfortunate spill right into a barrel of freshly churned butter. The birds, meanwhile, seemed to glide effortlessly through the invisible maze, perhaps even enjoying the spectacle of clumsy humans. And then, slowly, tentatively, the return of the chirping, often louder than before, as if the birds were protesting the interruption to their important work of being a nuisance. Historians still argue whether this adaptability was a true sign of advanced learning in the avian population, or simply a matter of sheer numerical advantage, overwhelming any temporary disruption. Whatever the cause, you were beginning to understand that winning this war would be as simple as shooing away a few pigeons from your picnic. The birds of Fotheringay-on-Wye were a force to be reckoned with, and they were, quite literally, everywhere. There was the idea of setting up shiny objects to scare them away: ribbons, old tin cans, even polished silver spoons stolen from kitchen drawers. Imagine these stern-faced individuals, accustomed to debates about drainage systems and public footpaths, now grappling with a foe that couldn't be reasoned with, couldn't be taxed, and certainly couldn't be persuaded to abide by municipal bylaws. Mayor Bumble, his usual placid demeanor replaced by a perpetually furrowed brow, would pace the council chambers, often stopping to swat angrily at an imaginary fly, or perhaps a phantom pigeon. The weekly meetings, once brief affairs concluded with a comforting cup of tea and a biscuit, now stretched for hours, filled with increasingly outlandish suggestions and the constant, distracting cooing from the eaves of the council hall itself. It was, frankly, an absolute nightmare for anyone attempting to conduct official business. You'd think the flashing light would deter them, wouldn't you? Instead, the birds seemed to find the glittering additions quite charming, often perching right on them, preening their feathers in the reflected light as if admiring their own reflection in a funhouse mirror. It was as if they were performing an elaborate avian fashion show, much to the exasperation of the human audience. It was in the air, on the rooftops, under the eaves, and, alarmingly, inside your chimneys. Imagine waking up, groggy and disoriented from a night of restless sleep, largely due to the continuous avian chatter, and finding a rather soot-covered pigeon staring at you from the fireplace. It was the kind of thing that made you question the very fabric of reality, or at least the structural integrity of your home. The early encounters, before the full scale of the problem was truly grasped, were often comically mismatched. There was poor Mr. Henderson, the town butcher, a man of considerable girth and even more considerable temper. It felt as though every bird from every surrounding county had decided Fotheringay-on-Wye was the place to be. Drawn by some invisible, irresistible siren call of unguarded grain and undefended rooftops. Mainstream historical accounts of similar avian infestations often point to ecological shifts or agricultural changes. But for Fotheringay-on-Wye, it felt more like a personal affront. A fringe tidbit from local folklore suggests that the birds were actually a curse laid upon the town by a disgruntled traveling bard whose artistic efforts had been poorly received. Of course, Mayor Bumble dismissed such fanciful notions, but you can understand why desperate times lead to desperate theories. He'd meticulously arrange his finest cuts of meat in the shop window, only to turn his back for a moment and find a brazen starling making off with a prime sausage or a flock of pigeons, turning his display into a rather unsanitary buffet. You could hear his booming curses echoing down the street, often punctuated by the frantic flapping of dozens of wings. It was a daily ritual, a kind of bizarre, feathered ballet of thievery and frustration. These individual battles, fought across every garden patch, every window ledge, and every open doorway, quickly taught the townspeople that these were no ordinary birds. Indeed, the sheer numbers of the birds began to defy all reasonable explanation. The initial response from the townsfolk was, to be frank, a bit haphazard. Then came the loud noises. Someone suggested ringing church bells incessantly as the birds continued their relentless assault on the town's peace and quiet. The collective frustration of the Fotheringay-on-Wye Town Council reached a boiling point. The official exasperation manifested in a series of escalating measures, each more desperate than the last. One particularly memorable council meeting saw the introduction of what was dramatically termed Operation Featherfall. This growing frustration also led to a burgeoning academic debate. The town council, realizing that traditional administrative methods were failing, began to entertain increasingly unconventional ideas. Given the escalating frustration and the birds' seemingly endless capacity for mischief, the town resorted to increasingly rudimentary and ineffective methods. You might imagine a scene straight out of a silent comedy, with villagers chasing after flocks of birds, waving brooms and shouting. And you wouldn't be far off. The collective desperation led to a series of rather comical, if entirely futile, endeavors that, in hindsight, seem almost charming in their naivety. His house became a local landmark, a vibrant purple beacon in a sea of muted cottages. And did it work? Well, a single, rather robust pigeon did take up residence on his chimney, seemingly unfazed by the chromatic assault. The Pigeon Patrol was a citizen-led initiative, comprised of volunteers eager to reclaim their quiet evenings and untarnished laundry. Imagine a diverse collection of townsfolk, armed not with swords and shields, but with brooms, nets, water pistols, and an impressive array of improvised noisemakers. Traditionally, the dogs of Fotheringay-on-Wye were loyal companions, content to snooze by the fire or chase after sticks. But now they were conscripted. For the first time, the birds faced a united front. The sheer persistence of the human effort began to wear on the avian invaders, even if only slightly. Historians still argue whether this prolonged human effort truly instilled a fear of humans in the bird population, or if it simply made Fotheringay-on-Wye a less attractive, less convenient place for them to congregate. Whatever the ultimate cause, the continuous presence of yelling humans, waving brooms, and occasionally enthusiastic dogs did force the birds to adapt. They became warier, less brazen in their daylight raids, and increasingly they shifted their operations to the quieter, less patrolled hours, particularly the early morning and late evening. The town, however, was now organized. They had a plan, even if that plan sometimes involved a rather silly-looking parade of broom-wielding citizens. The Pigeon Patrol, under the stern but kind guidance of the local dog catcher, attempted to teach the canines to actively pursue and harass the birds. You can just imagine the scene. A parade of bewildered hounds, some wagging their tails enthusiastically, others looking utterly confused, being led on leashes through the fields, pointed at flocks of sparrows, and encouraged to bark furiously. It was, shall we say, a mixed bag of results. Some dogs took to it with admirable gusto, becoming truly formidable bird-chasing machines. Others, like young Barnabas Terrier, simply preferred to roll in the grass, utterly oblivious to the ongoing avian war. Old man Fitzwilliam, still clinging to his purple theory, even tried to fashion a uniform out of dyed sheets, much to the amusement of his fellow patrollers. Their first parade through the market square was less a display of military might and more a charmingly chaotic procession. But their hearts, if not their marching skills, were certainly in the right place. Old man Fitzwilliam maintained until his dying day that it was a rogue pigeon, a particularly defiant one, and not indicative of the failure of his grand purple theory. One group would guard the granary, another the communal gardens, and a dedicated nocturnal unit, armed with lanterns and extra-loud clappers, would attempt to disrupt the birds' roosting patterns. This was a crucial mainstream historical fact for such local skirmishes. Organized community defense, even against seemingly trivial threats, often proved more effective than individual heroic efforts. The coordinated effort meant that when a flock descended on the bakery, for instance, a dozen shouts and waving arms would meet them, rather than just the exasperated cries of the lone baker. They tried everything from strategically placed bowls of particularly strong-smelling onions, a theory being that birds, much like certain humans, was it that they learned the loud noises were harmless, or just that so many were present that a few would always remain, eventually drawing the others back? Regardless, the simple, direct methods of deterrence proved utterly ineffective. You were witnessing a masterclass in avian resilience, a feathered obstinacy that would have been admirable if it weren't so utterly infuriating. The townsfolk were learning, very slowly and very painfully, that fighting birds required more than just good intentions and a loud shout. It required something far more organized, far more cunning, and perhaps a little bit more absurd. Would simply be repulsed by the pungent aroma to elaborate systems of string and bells, designed to create a constant jarring clang whenever a bird landed. You can picture Mayor Bumble, looking rather haggard, addressing a town hall packed with weary-eyed citizens. The air was thick with the scent of frustration and, perhaps, a hint of bird droppings. What they needed was coordination, strategy, and perhaps a uniform. Thus, with a grand, if slightly dusty, proclamation, the Pigeon Patrol was officially born. One of the most persistent and least successful methods involved the deployment of loud noises. We touched upon the church bells earlier, but the efforts quickly escalated. Someone, perhaps a bit too eager, after reading a treatise on optical illusions, suggested that if the entire town simultaneously held up mirrors or polished metal objects, the dazzling light would disorient the birds and drive them away. You can just picture it. At a pre-appointed signal, every man, woman, and child in Fotheringay-on-Wye would emerge from their homes, clutching anything shiny: teapots, frying pans, even grandmother's prized silver locket, and point it skyward. The sun, however, rarely cooperated, and on the few bright days, the effect was less blinding avian terror and more a gentle, shimmering kaleidoscope that the birds seemed to navigate with casual ease. It was a charming thought, perhaps, but a thoroughly impractical one, and mostly resulted in a lot of sore arms for the human participants. Imagine, if you will, the town's small brass band, usually reserved for seasonal parades and particularly lively funerals, being pressed into service. They'd stand in the market square, instruments at the ready, and on a signal from Mayor Bumble, launch into a cacophonous rendition of the Fotheringay-on-Wye anthem, or whatever loud, discordant tune they could muster. The theory was that the sheer volume would dislodge the birds from their perches and send them scattering for miles. The reality was rather different. The birds, after an initial startled flutter, would often simply resettle, sometimes even appearing to enjoy the impromptu concert, bobbing their heads in time with the off-key trumpets. You could almost hear a collective sigh of avian indifference. Then there was the grand idea of the reflected light campaign, a quirky, almost forgotten tidbit from this era of desperation. Involves the town's resident eccentric old man Fitzwilliam, who insisted that the birds were particularly sensitive to the color purple. Historians still argue whether the birds' apparent resistance to these varied assaults was a result of genuine adaptation and learning, or simply the immense statistical advantage of their numbers. The repeated failures of individual efforts and ad hoc solutions finally spurred the town council into more organized action. This wasn't a professional army, mind you. Fotheringay-on-Wye was a town of bakers, blacksmiths, farmers, and the occasional, surprisingly nimble grocer. The patrol was divided into shifts, ensuring constant vigilance. A quirky, almost unbelievable tidbit from this period involves the training of the town dogs. Despite the occasional comical failure, the formation of the Pigeon Patrol marked a significant shift. With the Pigeon Patrol now somewhat established, the townsfolk, ever resourceful in their desperation, began to experiment with unconventional bird traps. This was where the true eccentricities of Fotheringay really shone through. The theory, championed by the town baker, Mr. Buttercup, was that birds would be lured by the sweet scent of marmalade spread on a flat surface. This was the brainchild of young Timmy, the mayor's mischievous nephew, who had an overly vivid imagination. This was a mainstream historical fact, as net trapping has been used for centuries. But for the Fotheringay-on-Wye residents, it was a test of coordination. Was it true intelligence, or merely good fortune, that allowed them to elude the town's best efforts? What you must understand is that these were not professional pest controllers. These were ordinary people, driven to extraordinary lengths by an extraordinary nuisance. The birds, particularly the sparrows and pigeons, seemed to understand the strategic importance of this building. They tried everything, hanging shimmering streamers that supposedly disoriented the birds, installing loud clackers that made a tremendous noise every time the wind blew, and even, in one memorable instance, dressing a life-sized mannequin in Farmer Giles's overalls and positioning it right by the main entrance. Without modern pest control, a sustained animal infestation could genuinely threaten a community's survival. For Fotheringay-on-Wye, it wasn't just about nuisance, it was about potential famine if the birds continued unchecked. Historians still argue whether the birds' focused attacks on the granary were a deliberate strategic move to target the town's weakness, or simply a natural outcome of instinct guiding them to the most abundant food source. To the beleaguered residents, however, it certainly felt like a calculated assault on their very sustenance. The daily battles at the granary were a constant reminder that this was more than just a minor inconvenience. It was a war for their bread, literally and figuratively. The mannequin, named Giles Jr. by the patrol, was meant to be a terrifying deterrent. For about an hour, it worked. Then, a particularly bold pigeon landed on Giles Jr.'s head and began to preen itself, utterly undisturbed. It was a rather deflating sight for the weary guards. They'd launch coordinated raids, not in one grand swoop, but in waves, darting under eaves. Through ventilation shafts, the idea was to create a sticky barrier around the base of the granary doors. The thinking was that if the birds' feet got bogged down in the sweet goo, they couldn't get in, so a thick, dark ring of molasses was spread. What happened, however, was that the molasses simply attracted every insect within a 10-mile radius, creating a buzzing, sticky, insect-laden barrier that was far more unpleasant for the humans to deal with than the birds. The birds, being surprisingly agile, would often just hop over the sticky mess or land on the wall above it, seemingly unconcerned by the sweet, buggy moat. And even, alarmingly, through any momentary lapse in human vigilance, when a door was left ajar, you'd hear the frantic cries of the granary keeper, old Silas Crumble, a man whose life revolved around the safekeeping of grain, punctuated by the frantic flapping of wings and the telltale rustle of tiny bodies in sacks. And while many of their ideas were hilariously ineffective, they spoke to a deep-seated human desire to solve problems, even when those problems came with wings and an insatiable appetite for grain. The birds, meanwhile, seemed to observe these human follies with a detached amusement, perhaps even taking notes for their next audacious maneuver. Picture the townsfolk pulling on ropes, attempting to synchronize their throws. Their relentless presence was felt most keenly, however, at the town's granary. This was the heart of the community's food supply, a vast wooden structure brimming with sacks of wheat, oats, and barley, essentially an all-you-can-eat buffet for a feathered army. You can imagine the tension in the air, a palpable sense of dread every time a shadow passed over the granary roof. It was here that the Great Sparrow War saw some of its most intense and frustrating skirmishes. More often than not, the nets would tangle or simply miss their mark, allowing the birds to swoop underneath with an almost contemptuous grace. Occasionally, a single unfortunate bird would get ensnared, leading to a momentary triumph before the complicated process of disentanglement began. It was a lot of effort for very little avian yield. He dug a series of small, conical holes in his garden, lined them with shiny pebbles, and then placed a single juicy worm at the bottom of each. His logic was that the birds, seeing the worm, would dive headfirst into the hole, become disoriented by the shiny pebbles, and be unable to get out. For a day or two, Timmy would proudly display his wormholes, but inevitably he'd find the worms gone, and no birds in sight. It turns out, birds are quite good at snatching things from holes without fully committing to a dive, much to Timmy's youthful chagrin. Once they landed, their feet would get hopelessly stuck, allowing for easy capture and relocation. You can just picture it, glistening blobs of citrusy jam strategically placed on rooftops and windowsills. The result? A lot of very sticky birds who, after a brief struggle, would simply fly off, leaving behind a trail of orange footprints and a confused baker. It turned out marmalade was less of a trap and more of a rather messy, albeit delicious, temporary inconvenience for the birds. Forget your standard cages or nets. These were homegrown, often hilarious, contraptions born from ingenuity and an almost artistic desire to outsmart their feathered foes. Imagine an elderly spinster, Miss Penelope Primrose, known for her delicate embroidery, meticulously constructing a miniature guillotine from mousetrap springs and thread designed to snap shut on a particularly plump pigeon feasting on her prize-winning nasturtiums. It was, of course, utterly harmless to the birds, and mostly just served to launch tiny bits of seed into the air, but the intent was certainly there. One popular, though ultimately ineffective, design was the sticky marmalade trap. A quirky tidbit from this period recounts the tale of the wormhole trap. Then there was the collective effort to construct giant nets flung from rooftops or across large open spaces. Historians still argue whether the birds developed a sort of trap avoidance instinct during this period, or if the traps were simply so poorly conceived and executed that they posed no real threat. Despite the formation of the pigeon patrol and the myriad of imaginative flawed traps, the siege of the granary wasn't a sudden, dramatic attack, but a slow, insidious erosion of defenses. The pigeon patrol implemented a rotating guard system at the granary, with volunteers standing sentinel day and night. A quirky tidbit from the granary siege involved the ingenious, but ultimately unsuccessful, attempt to use molasses. This persistent attack on the granary forced the town to confront a significant mainstream historical fact: the vulnerability of food supplies in pre-industrial societies. As the siege of the granary continued and the birds' cunning seemed to grow with each passing day, a strange theory began to circulate amongst the weary residents of Fotheringay-on-Wye. What if the birds were unjust, acting on instinct? You see, the birds didn't just attack randomly. They seemed to target specific weaknesses. They'd wait until the guard changed at the granary, or until a particularly strong gust of wind created a momentary opening in a net. The idea was that if they could placate the perceived leader, the rest of the birds would follow suit. It was a kind of avian diplomacy attempted by desperate people. Unsurprisingly, it resulted in even more birds descending upon the town, drawn by the free meal. An old man Squawk, if he existed, remained utterly unimpressed by their meager offerings, probably laughing his one-eyed head off. It was this perceived strategic thinking that led to the whispers of an organized avian enemy, a kind of feathered general directing the airborne war. Was there a true leader, or was it merely the most audacious birds setting a precedent for others to follow? Regardless of the truth, the concept of a feathered mastermind provided a curious psychological coping mechanism for the townsfolk. It was, in a strange way, comforting to imagine a cunning adversary rather than an unthinking, uncontrollable natural phenomenon. It gave them a target for their frustration, even if that target was an imaginary, one-eyed pigeon. And you, nestled in your bed, can perhaps appreciate the gentle humor in a town, driven to distraction, inventing a feathered Moriarty to explain their woes. A mainstream historical fact of human psychology is that in the face of an unpredictable or seemingly irrational threat, people often seek to attribute human-like agency or intelligence to better comprehend it. What if there was a feathered mastermind pulling the strings? The villagers named him Old Man Squawk. Old Man Squawk was rumored to perch high above the town square, observing human movements with an unnerving stillness, only to let out a series of peculiar coos that seemed to send his feathered troops into immediate action. You'd swear you saw him nod, or give a subtle flick of his head, and suddenly a flock would descend on a freshly baked pie left cooling on a windowsill. It was, of course, entirely coincidental. But try telling that to a sleep-deprived baker who just lost his morning's profits to a flock of avian bandits. You can almost hear the whispered conversations in the flickering candlelight as villagers, driven to the brink of exhaustion by incessant squawking, started to attribute almost human-like intelligence to their avian adversaries. It sounds absurd, of course, a flight of fancy. But when you're constantly outwitted by a flock of pigeons, logic tends to take a back seat to wild speculation. This theory of a singular, brilliant bird leader, perhaps a particularly large crow or an exceptionally cunning raven, gained traction with every failed human attempt to deter them. One particular, almost mythical bird became the focus of these suspicions. A large, one-eyed pigeon with a strangely knowing glint in its remaining eye. A quirky, fringe tidbit emerged from this period. Some residents began leaving out offerings of particularly stale bread crusts, hoping to appease Old Man Squawk. Historians still argue whether the apparent coordination of the birds was indeed a testament to some form of collective intelligence, or simply a manifestation of highly effective instinctual behaviors, perhaps amplified by population density and shared environmental cues. The idea of a feathered mastermind, while perhaps offering a convenient scapegoat, didn't actually solve the bird problem. So, with conventional and unconventional methods failing, the town council, in a moment of exasperated desperation, decided to consult the experts. He carried a large, leather-bound book and a pair of extraordinarily powerful binoculars. The townsfolk, including a hopeful Mayor, Bumble, and a silently skeptical old man Fitzwilliam, gathered to hear his pronouncements. Professor Finch spent days observing the birds, taking meticulous notes, peering through his binoculars at the smallest sparrow. He brought with him a peculiar device, a large brass contraption with a hand crank that he claimed emitted a high-pitched frequency inaudible to humans but deeply unpleasant to birds. Was his failure due to academic arrogance or local stubbornness? Whatever the reason, the expert consultation, far from solving the problem, only added another layer of frustration. Every household with a cat was encouraged to donate their feline friend to the front lines of the avian war. For centuries, across various cultures, cats were kept precisely for their predatory instincts, especially against rodents and, yes, birds. You see, the cats of Fotheringay-on-Wye were, by and large, rather domesticated creatures. Many preferred napping by the fire to actual hunting. Some, upon encountering a flock of 1,000 squawking birds, simply turned tail and fled, perhaps questioning their life choices. A few, the truly intrepid ones, did manage to bag a sparrow or two, much to the delight of the townsfolk, but the sheer volume of the birds often overwhelmed them. It was like sending a handful of sleepy house cats to fight an entire feathered army. A rather unfair fight, if you think about it. So, in a way, Fotheringay-on-Wye was simply harking back to an age-old method. Muffin, accustomed to a diet of cream and gentle strokes, was placed strategically near the granary. You can picture her, all pristine white fur, looking utterly disdainful of the entire situation. Rather than hunting birds, Muffin quickly discovered that the granary, with its endless supply of grain, also attracted a rather plump and slow-moving population of mice. So, while Muffin proved utterly useless in the avian war, she single-handedly solved the granary's rodent problem, becoming an unexpected, albeit unintentional, hero. Her owners, however, still had birds perched on their chimney. The hope was that these natural hunters would thin the avian ranks, instill fear, and reclaim the skies for humanity. Stray cats, usually regarded as a minor nuisance, were suddenly elevated to the status of potential heroes. You can imagine the scene: a motley collection of tabbies, gingers, calicos, and even a particularly grumpy Siamese, all looking utterly bewildered as they were gently, or sometimes not so gently, ushered into the fields and around the granary. It was a charming thought, really, a furry, four-legged cavalry charging into battle against the feathered menace. Did the birds simply learn to avoid the cats? Or did the cats simply decide that chasing hundreds of birds was far too much effort for too little reward? Whatever the dynamic, the cat campaign, while providing some amusement and a few unexpected victories, certainly didn't turn the tide of the Great Sparrow War. You could almost hear the birds cooing with laughter from the safety of the treetops, watching the bewildered felines. The townsfolk were left with the grim realization that even the learned professors didn't have a quick fix. They were, it seemed, truly on their own against the feathered menace. He set it up in the market square, cranked the handle with great enthusiasm, and waited. The only immediate effect was that a passing dog started howling mournfully, and a group of children began to giggle uncontrollably. The birds, meanwhile, continued their relentless pecking, seemingly unbothered by the scientific marvel. Professor Finch adjusted a few dials, listened intently, then sighed, admitting that perhaps the Fotheringay-on-Wye birds were anomalously resilient to sonic disruption, and even to the amusement of some attempting to communicate with them through a series of rather unconvincing bird calls. You can imagine the hopeful buzz that rippled through Fotheringay-on-Wye when it was announced that a renowned ornithologist, Professor Alistair Finch, would be arriving. You see, if the learned Professor Finch couldn't scare away the birds, perhaps a creature with a more direct approach could. The logic was simple: cats hunt birds. Therefore, more cats would equal fewer birds. What could possibly go wrong? He informed the council that the birds were not, in fact, being led by a one-eyed pigeon named Old Man Squawk. You see, while the residents hated the sparrows and pigeons, they weren't entirely keen on welcoming creatures that might also take a liking to their chickens, their smaller pets, or indeed, the occasional, unattended picnic basket. One farmer vehemently argued that he'd rather deal with 1,000 sparrows than a single hawk with a taste for prime lamb. The solution, while scientifically sound, was deemed too wild for Fotheringay-on. A significant mainstream historical fact is that attributing human-like command structures to animal behavior often misinterprets natural phenomena. Instead, he explained, the birds were simply acting on powerful natural instincts, amplified by an unusually abundant food source and a lack of natural predators in the immediate vicinity. He suggested a comprehensive plan involving improved granary sealing, habitat modification, and, rather clinically, the introduction of natural predators like raptors. Finally, professional help. Someone with scientific knowledge, perhaps a degree in advanced bird shaming, would surely have the answer. Professor Finch arrived in a rather dusty carriage, a stern-looking man with a neatly trimmed beard and an air of profound academic detachment. His initial findings, delivered in a dry, academic tone, were, to put it mildly, disheartening. This is where the consultations went spectacularly awry. The idea of introducing raptors, birds of prey like falcons and hawks, was met with widespread panic. A particularly quirky tidbit from this consultation period involves Professor Finch's attempt to use sound frequencies to deter the birds. Historians still argue whether Professor Finch's scientific approach was simply too detached from the practical realities of small-town life, or if the townspeople were simply too entrenched in their own, less scientific solutions. With the scientific approach having well flown the coop, the residents of Fotheringay-on-Wye turned to a more primal solution: the introduction of feline allies. The town, never one to do things by halves when desperate, launched a cat conscription drive. A mainstream historical fact often overlooked in such accounts is the historical role of cats in pest control. The results, however, were mixed. A particularly quirky tidbit from this feline enlistment period involved Mrs. Higgins's prize-winning Persian, a fluffy, pampered creature named Muffin. Historians still argue whether the limited success of the feline allies was due to the sheer numerical superiority of the birds, the inherent laziness of pampered house cats, or perhaps a curious, unspoken truce between the two animal populations. You might think a war against birds would be free of casualties, but for the townsfolk of Fotheringay-on-Wye, the avian conflict brought its own peculiar set of civilian inconveniences and humorous injuries. While no one was seriously harmed, this wasn't that kind of war. Thankfully, the cumulative effect of constant avian harassment began to wear on everyone's nerves and, occasionally, their dignity. Mrs. Gable, the same one from the scarecrow incident, found herself in a minor wrestling match with a particularly tenacious pigeon over a freshly baked loaf of bread. She emerged victorious, but the bread was rather squashed, and her spectacles were askew. There was the gentleman who, in a valiant effort to swat a pigeon from his chimney, lost his footing on the roof and slid precariously close to the edge. He was rescued, shaken but unharmed, by the quick thinking of his neighbor. Another incident involved a young lad who, in his eagerness to chase a flock from a fruit tree, ran headlong into a clothesline, emerging with a rather impressive, though temporary, pattern of crisscross marks on his forehead. This focus on minor mishaps and comical failures highlights a mainstream historical fact. Even in small conflicts, unintended consequences and human error are always present. Young Thomas, the baker's apprentice, learned the hard way that leaving a basket of warm pastries unattended on the delivery cart was an open invitation for a feathered raid. Did the accumulation of smeared laundry and near falls strengthen their collective will to fight, Or did it simply wear them down into a state of weary resignation? What is clear is that the Great Sparrow War, while lacking in dramatic battle scars, left its own peculiar mark on the people of Fotheringay-on-Wye, reminding them that even the smallest adversaries can cause the biggest headaches and sometimes the most peculiar bumps and bruises. He'd chase them, flailing his arms, only to return to the bakery looking utterly defeated, covered in flour and birdseed. These weren't grave injuries, of course, but they were certainly morale-sapping. Imagine trying to simply go about your daily business, forever on alert, forever dodging. One of the most common, and certainly most irritating, types of casualty was the incessant aerial bombardment of, well, you know, laundry, freshly hung out to dry, would inevitably return with telltale white splatters. Hats, carefully placed on heads, became unwitting targets. The town's barber, Mr. Snip, kept a clean rag permanently draped over his bald spot, not for warmth, but as a shield against surprise attacks from above. It was a constant battle against unexpected adornments, leading to much frustrated sighing and muttered curses. You quickly learned to look up before stepping out, a new, almost unconscious habit. Then there were the more direct encounters. A quirky tidbit from this period describes the hat tax. Not a real tax, mind you, but a jocular custom that emerged amongst the townsfolk. If a bird managed to successfully deposit its calling card on your hat in public, you were obligated to buy the next round of lukewarm ale at the local tavern. It was a small way to inject some levity into a frustrating situation, turning a moment of indignity into a shared, if slightly grumbling, laugh. Most people, it's worth noting, started wearing very wide-brimmed hats. The more serious, albeit still mild, injuries often involved clumsy attempts at bird deterrence. Historians still argue whether these constant, minor irritations contributed more to the town's resolve or its eventual fatigue. As the war of attrition continued and the minor mishaps accumulated, the town council, in a surprisingly savvy move, decided that a more psychological approach might be necessary. If they couldn't physically deter the birds, perhaps they could demoralize them. They featured cheerful, determined-looking villagers wielding brooms and nets, with stern, exaggerated caricatures of pigeons looking utterly terrified. The caption read, "Our mayor says, shoo." This became a minor catchphrase around town, often muttered under breath when a particularly brazen bird landed too close. Old Mrs. Gable swore that she saw a pigeon deliberately peck at the eye of a drawn bird on one of the posters, as if engaging in some form of avian counter-propaganda. Did the propaganda stiffen their resolve, allowing them to endure the long conflict, or was it simply a futile gesture in the face of overwhelming natural forces? You see, fighting a war against an enemy that simply wants your grain and a cozy nesting spot is exhausting. The town council, swayed by the weariness of its citizens, decided to explore the possibility of a truce that never was. The townsfolk watched with bated breath, hoping for a sign that their feathered adversaries understood the terms of this unspoken agreement. After gorging themselves in the sanctuary, they would, with what seemed like deliberate insolence, fly directly over the town, dropping their opinions on the main street before heading back for another helping of free grain. It was as if they were saying, "Thanks for the meal, but we're still in charge." The sanctuary became less a peace offering and more a convenient refueling station for their continued raids. For a few glorious hours, it seemed to work. Did the birds genuinely comprehend the concept of a truce, or did they merely see an abundant food source and exploit it to their fullest advantage while continuing their established habits? Whatever the interpretation, the failed truce was a crushing blow to town morale. The brief hope of an end to the squawking siege was extinguished, replaced by a renewed sense of weary resignation. It was a stark reminder that some conflicts cannot be resolved through diplomacy, especially when one side communicates entirely through chirps and droppings. A vast flock of sparrows and pigeons descended upon the designated sanctuary, feasting voraciously. A collective sigh of relief rippled through Fotheringay-on-Wye. Perhaps, just perhaps, peace had been achieved. Imagine the scene. Mayor Bumble, ever the optimist, sending out envoys. Well, not really envoys, more like a few brave volunteers with white flags, to the edge of the town, hoping to communicate a desire for peaceful coexistence. What is clear is that the posters, with their gentle humor and earnest intent, became a peculiar symbol of Fotheringay-on-Wye's stubborn refusal to simply surrender their tranquil existence to a feathered tyranny. You can almost feel the collective sigh of weariness and quiet determination emanating from those crudely drawn images. While almost certainly coincidental, it certainly fueled the local lore of the bird's cunning. More concretely, some birds actually began to tear strips from the posters to use as nesting material, turning the very symbols of human defiance into comfortable, if slightly inflammatory, bird homes. They would set aside a designated bird sanctuary, a large field just outside the town's perimeter, where they would scatter a generous amount of grain, hoping to entice the birds away from the granary and the town proper. The idea was to offer a peace treaty, a clear boundary, and a plentiful food source in exchange for the birds leaving the human-occupied areas alone. It was, in essence, an attempt at avian appeasement, a mainstream historical fact where entities attempt to satisfy an aggressor's demands to avoid further conflict. It was a subtle, almost insulting act of defiance, and certainly a testament to the bird's relentless practicality. The aim wasn't necessarily to scare the birds, though perhaps the birds, with their uncanny knack for observation, found the artistic depictions of their impending doom rather amusing, but to foster a sense of unity and shared purpose among the human residents. After all, nothing brings a community together like a common enemy, even one with tiny wings and an irritating squawk. Slogans like "a clean roof is a happy roof," or "Fotheringay-on-Wye, no room for coup," adorned the streets. It was a classic example of a mainstream historical fact. Governments and communities, even against non-human adversaries, often resort to public information campaigns to rally support and shape perception. Or, more accurately, if they couldn't demoralize the birds, they could at least boost human morale. This led to the emergence of propaganda posters. You might imagine stirring images of eagles soaring or valiant knights slaying dragons. But for Fotheringay-on-Wye, the propaganda was, like most things, rather charmingly rustic and a little bit silly. These posters, hand-drawn by the local art teacher, Miss Violet Scribble, and often printed on repurposed flour sacks, appeared on every lamppost, every shop window, and even, daringly, on the side of the granary itself. One particularly popular poster depicted a resolute Mayor Bumble, his jaw set and his spectacles gleaming, pointing decisively towards a fleeing, cartoonish bird. A quirky tidbit regarding these posters involves the bird's reaction to them. Historians still argue whether these morale-boosting efforts truly impacted the outcome of the war, or if they merely served as a comforting distraction for the weary townsfolk. Despite the visual encouragement of the propaganda posters, the constant drain on resources and patience eventually led to a desperate plea for peace. The plan, devised by a well-meaning but utterly naive committee, involved a grand gesture of goodwill. You can picture the day, the field meticulously prepared, shimmering with golden grain. But remember the bird's uncanny cunning. A quirky tidbit from this ill-fated truce involves a particularly bold group of pigeons. Historians still argue whether this was a true betrayal by the birds, a sign of their continued malevolence, or simply a misunderstanding of human intentions. The peculiar, ongoing avian conflict in Fotheringay-on-Wye, with its comical failures and desperate measures, was simply too unusual to remain a local secret. You can imagine the whispers spreading from village to village, carried by traveling merchants and gossiping postmen. Eventually, the tale of a small, sleepy town declaring war on its bird population reached the ears of journalists in far-off cities, and soon international news spread. Ornithologists, amateur birdwatchers, and even a few enterprising hawkers selling miracle bird repellent descended upon the town. Determined to get the bird's-eye view of the conflict, he attempted to climb the tallest oak tree in the town square, hoping to observe a bird roost up close. Did the international spotlight bring new ideas or resources, or did it simply turn their private misery into public spectacle, making them feel more like a curiosity than a community in need? It wasn't just their numbers, or their uncanny ability to evade traps. It was also the subtle ways in which the environment, and perhaps even human actions, provided the sparrows unexpected allies. The charming, old-fashioned cottages, with their numerous eaves, gables, and uncapped chimneys, provided an abundance of perfect nesting sites. Despite the best efforts of the diligent town sweepers, crumbs from the bakery, spilled grain from the granary, the residents had, for years, allowed a portion of the fallen apples to remain on the ground, believing it enriched the soil. What they didn't realize was that these fermenting apples were providing a rather potent, albeit unintended, source of sugar for the birds. Some residents swore they saw particularly plump sparrows wobbling slightly after a feast, leading to the jocular theory of inebriated birds. While perhaps an exaggeration, it certainly added to the birds' perceived invincibility. And discarded scraps from market day provided an almost limitless supply of sustenance. Or if their sheer numbers allowed for greater experimentation and adaptation, making them seem more cunning than they truly were. Was it a passive advantage from their surroundings, or an active exploitation of human habits? Regardless, it became increasingly clear that the fight was not just against the birds themselves, but against the very conditions that allowed them to flourish. You were beginning to appreciate that sometimes the enemy's greatest strength lies not in their direct attacks, but in the unwitting aid they receive from their surroundings. You can imagine the birds, like tiny feathered gleaners, meticulously picking through every discarded morsel, growing plumper and more numerous with each passing day. It was a vicious cycle. The more food they found, the more they thrived, and the more they thrived, the bigger the problem became. Every nook and cranny became a potential bird apartment, allowing them to breed unmolested and close to their food sources. A mainstream historical fact is that human settlements, by their very nature, often create ideal habitats for certain adaptable species, inadvertently increasing their populations. For the birds, Fotheringay-on-Wye was less a battleground and more a five-star resort with complimentary buffet. You see, while the townsfolk were busy fighting a war, the birds were quietly capitalizing on every unintended advantage. While no definitive solutions arrived with the curious onlookers, the fact that their unique plight was being discussed far and wide certainly made the residents of Fotheringay-on-Wye feel less alone, even if the birds remained utterly unimpressed by their fame. The Great Sparrow War had truly taken flight in more ways than one. He promptly got stuck, necessitating a rather undignified rescue by the very pigeon patrol members he had initially mocked. The incident, of course, made for another amusing anecdote in the papers, further cementing Fotheringay-on-Wye's reputation as the town where even the journalists could unescape the avian chaos. They'd stand in the market square, pointing and murmuring, observing the seemingly endless aerial ballet of birds, trying to comprehend how such a small problem could escalate into such a prolonged conflict. You might find it amusing, this little town becoming a tourist attraction for its ornithological woes. But for the residents, it was just another layer of annoyance on top of their feathered tormentors. Fotheringay-on-Wye, once a bastion of uneventful tranquility, suddenly found itself a strange, minor celebrity on the global stage. Newspapers, starved for quaint and humorous stories, ran sensationalized articles, feathered fury in or town battles beaks. The war for Wye continues. You can almost picture the illustrations, exaggerated drawings of tiny birds besieging giant, bewildered humans. This sudden notoriety was, to put it mildly, bewildering for the townsfolk. They weren't seeking fame, they just wanted their quiet lives back. A mainstream historical fact is that unusual or bizarre local events often capture public imagination, especially when they offer a humorous or relatable human struggle against seemingly insurmountable odds. Visitors, both curious and skeptical, began to arrive. A particularly quirky tidbit from this period of newfound fame involves a rather daring reporter from a London newspaper. Historians still argue whether the increased external attention helped or hindered the town's efforts. Despite the flurry of media attention and the fleeting hope of external aid, the birds of Fotheringay-on-Wye proved remarkably resilient. One of their most significant allies was, ironically, the very architecture of the town itself. Then there was the waste. A quirky tidbit that emerged from this period involved the town's beloved apple orchard. Historians still argue whether the birds' success was primarily due to these environmental factors. With their more traditional methods thwarted and their feathered adversaries seemingly empowered by the very fabric of the town, the desperate residents of Fotheringay-on-Wye turned their attention to inventing bizarre, custom-made bird-repelling gadgets. If store-bought solutions wouldn't work, perhaps pure, unadulterated ingenuity would. This contraption, designed by a retired naval engineer with an overly optimistic view of aerodynamics, consisted of a series of large, rotating wooden blades attached to a complex arrangement of whistles and bells and wire, which were then stuck into the ground around every garden and crop field. For the residents of Fotheringay-on-Wye, every failed invention was a testament to their persistence, if not their engineering prowess. Each whirry, clanking, or gleaming device was a monument to human determination against a relentless, feathered foe that simply refused to be out-gadgeted. Historians still argue whether the lack of success of these gadgets was due to fundamental flaws in their design, or if the birds had simply developed an unparalleled adaptability to human attempts at deterrence. This meant the introduction of nocturnal raids. You might picture birds roosting peacefully at night, nestled in their nests. But no, not the birds of Fotheringay-on-Wye. Any gap in the clouds. Poor old Bartholomew. He often woke before dawn for his duties, and during the bird war, he became an unwitting victim of feathered mischief. One morning, he found his church key, usually kept on a hook by his door, completely missing. After a frantic search, he discovered it gleaming faintly in the dim light, lodged precariously in the top of the belfry, almost certainly placed there by a particularly impudent crow. It was as if the birds were playing pranks, adding insult to injury, to launch their quiet incursions. They learned that the most effective time to pilfer seeds from gardens was just before dawn, when the town was at its deepest slumber. Or they'd target chimneys, not just for nesting, but for dropping in debris, causing smoke to billow back into hearths at the most inconvenient times. A mainstream historical fact is that nocturnal animal behavior often increases when daytime human activity makes foraging or nesting too risky, showcasing a clear adaptive response. They became creatures of the twilight and the pre-dawn, adding another layer of exhaustion to the already weary town. Was it the inventions that were truly flawed, or the birds that were truly invincible? Strategic adaptation by the birds to exploit human sleep patterns, or simply a natural response to increased daytime pressure? Did they choose to raid at night, or were they forced to? Whatever the intent, the result was the same. Even the quiet hours were no longer truly quiet. You, comfortably tucked in now, can perhaps appreciate the sheer exhaustion that must have descended upon the residents of Fotheringay-on-Wye, whose days were spent battling birds and whose nights were disrupted by their stealthy, relentless intrusions. The war was no longer confined to daylight. It had infiltrated their dreams, becoming a constant, all-encompassing presence. And then the distinct, infuriating sound of tiny beaks pecking at something just outside your window, or worse, on your roof. These weren't grand, coordinated assaults, but sneaky, opportunistic forays under the cover of darkness. The granary, despite its daytime guards, became particularly vulnerable. You could almost hear the muffled arguments of the night watchmen, trying to shoo away shadowy forms with whispered curses and frantic waves of their lanterns. You, listening now, might imagine the exasperated sighs of the inventors as their latest masterpiece failed to scare even a single plump pigeon. The theory was that the constant flashing and spinning would disorient the birds and prevent them from landing. A quirky tidbit from this effort involved old Mrs. Higgins, whose arthritic fingers struggled with the precise folding of the tin, often accidentally slicing herself. Her garden, however, became a shimmering, dazzling display, looking less like a bird deterrent and more like an avant-garde art installation. The birds, meanwhile, seemed to navigate the sparkling maze with ease, perhaps even enjoying the visual spectacle as they swooped in for a quick snack. The idea was that, as the wind spun the blades, it would generate a cacophony of terrifying noises, audible across the entire town, driving the birds into a frenzy of fear. You can almost picture it, a towering, ungainly wooden structure, creaking and groaning as it was hoisted into the market square. The result? A tremendous amount of noise, certainly, but it sounded less like a terrifying avian alarm and more like a badly tuned orchestra warming up for a very long, very painful concert. The birds, after an initial mild curiosity, seemed to completely ignore it, perhaps even finding its monotonous drone oddly soothing for their afternoon naps. You can imagine the workshops of the town's tinkers and artisans, normally filled with the precise sounds of clockmaking or shoemending, now clanking and worry with the construction of utterly preposterous avian deterrents. One of the most ambitious and spectacularly failed inventions was the wind-powered sonic scare model. Then there was the reflective pinwheel perimeter. This involved creating thousands of small, highly reflective pinwheels, painstakingly crafted from polished tin cans, a mainstream historical fact of human problem-solving, particularly in times of crisis, is the human tendency towards inventiveness and trial and error, even when the results are far from successful. These bizarre contraptions, born of desperation and a healthy dose of mechanical optimism, served as a poignant reminder of the town's struggle. As the inventive gadgets clanked and whirred to no avail, the birds of Fotheringay-on-Wye seemed to adapt their tactics, turning their attention to the hours when human vigilance naturally waned. Imagine lying in your bed, just drifting off to sleep when you hear it. A sudden flutter of wings, a faint scrabbling. The birds would exploit any sliver of moonlight. A quirky tidbit from these nocturnal raids involves the town's bell ringer. Historians still argue whether this shift to nocturnal activity was a deliberate. The relentless avian assault, particularly the shift to nocturnal raids, began to take a significant toll on Fotheringay-on-Wye beyond just sleep deprivation. The economic impact of the war slowly started to cripple the town. Farmers, despite their best efforts, saw their yields significantly reduced. Fields of wheat, meticulously tended, would be raided by flocks so vast they almost stripped the stalks bare. Fruit trees, heavy with ripening apples and pears, became avian buffets. Was the avian war the primary cause of their financial woes, or merely an exacerbating factor? What is undeniable, however, is that the bird problem, once a mere irritation, had grown into a significant economic burden. Every morning, precisely at 6 a.m., he would take his terrier, Berkeley, for a brisk walk around the town square, concluding with a stop at the bakery for a fresh scone. Had the birds finally taken their revenge? Was Old Man Squawk, the mythical one-eyed pigeon, truly a feathered mastermind capable of abducting civic leaders? They scoured the riverbanks, checked every shed, and even, rather absurdly, peered into every large bird's nest they could find, half expecting to discover the mayor tucked away amongst a clutch of eggs. Weeks later, a bewildered farmer, miles outside Fotheringay-on-Wye, reported finding a man who vaguely matched the mayor's description, muttering about the constant pecking and the lack of a proper scone. Was he truly lost, or was he just done? Whatever the truth, his temporary absence served as a chilling reminder to the townsfolk of the profound impact this seemingly trivial conflict was having on their lives. Even the staunchest among them felt a shiver of understanding. The bird war was not just affecting their crops and their clothes. It was chipping away at their very sanity. The man, who later confirmed he was indeed Mayor Higgins, claimed he had simply walked until the silence was deafening. He had, apparently, wandered off in a sleep-deprived haze, seeking absolute quiet. It was a testament to the sheer mental toll the bird war was taking. You can almost picture the comical image. a group of broom-wielding citizens, looking up into trees with binoculars, calling out, "Mayor Higgins, are you up there?" Or had the pressure of the avian war finally driven the good mayor to seek refuge in a quieter, bird-free locale, perhaps a soundproofed cave somewhere? A mainstream historical fact is that during times of prolonged stress or unconventional conflict, rumors and fantastical explanations often proliferate, filling the void of concrete information. Then, at 7 a.m., he would be at his desk in the town hall, ready to tackle the day's municipal challenges, however feathery. But one crisp autumn morning, Berkeley returned alone, looking utterly confused, and there was no sign of the mayor. You, listening comfortably now, can appreciate that even a war against tiny creatures can have very real, very tangible consequences for a community struggling to survive and thrive. The charming, sleepy town was becoming, quite literally, pecked into poverty. This meant less produce to sell at market, leading to lower incomes for the farmers and higher prices for everyone else. Fotheringay-on-Wye was struck by an entirely new and baffling development: the disappearance of Mayor Higgins. You can imagine the stir it caused. Mayor Bumble was one thing, a man struggling with bird-related woes, but Mayor Higgins, the very symbol of the town's steadfastness. His absence added a layer of bewildering mystery to the already chaotic avian war. Imagine the frustration. You toil for months, only for your hard work to become bird food. This direct assault on their primary livelihood was a mainstream historical fact for agricultural communities facing pest infestations, often leading to widespread hardship. You see, a town that can't effectively protect its harvests, its market goods, or even its public spaces, is a town that struggles to make a living. Merchants at the market had to spend more time shooing birds away than serving customers, leading to lost sales and a general air of distraction. This wasn't an official town levy, but a cynical joke that circulated amongst the townsfolk. Every time a business owner lost goods to the birds, they would sarcastically declare, "Well, there goes my sparrow tax." It was a gallows humor, a way of acknowledging the financial bleeding without actually giving in to despair. The sheer number of times this phrase was uttered each day certainly indicated the severity of the economic pinch. Even the innkeeper, usually a source of good cheer, noted, who perhaps preferred to stay in towns where the greatest concern was unto pigeon dive-bombing their evening meal. The constant cleanup efforts also consumed valuable time and resources. Imagine the cost of constantly re-laundering clothes or sweeping bird droppings from every public thoroughfare. The endless battle against birds wasn't just a nuisance. It was a drain on their collective purse, making life considerably more difficult for everyone. The most obvious impact was on the town's agricultural backbone. Beyond farming, local businesses also suffered. The baker, Mr. Buttercup, found his ingredients constantly threatened and his freshly baked goods requiring constant vigilance. A quirky tidbit from this period involves the sparrow tax. Historians still argue whether the economic downturn in Fotheringay-on-Wye during this period was solely attributable to the birds, or if other broader economic shifts played a role. Just as the economic strain began to tighten its grip and the cumulative exhaustion threatened to break the town's spirit, Mayor Barnaby Higgins, a portly man with a booming laugh and an unshakable belief in the power of a good, strong cup of tea, was known for his meticulous routines. The town, already on edge from the constant bird battles, erupted into a flurry of speculation. The pigeon patrol, usually focused on bird deterrence, quickly shifted gears to a search and rescue mission. A particularly quirky tidbit emerged from this baffling disappearance. Historians still argue whether Mayor Higgins's disappearance was a genuine psychological break caused by the unrelenting bird problem, or a premeditated, albeit poorly executed, escape attempt from the pressures of leadership. The disappearance of Mayor Higgins, followed by his rather sheepish, bird-induced return, was a turning point for Fotheringay-on-Wye. It was the moment the town collectively realized that their feathered adversaries, for all their avian charm, were genuinely breaking their spirits. But strangely, this low point also became the catalyst for a subtle turn of the tide. You see, sometimes it's when you've hit rock bottom that you find a renewed sense of purpose, a quiet, stubborn determination to simply not be defeated by a bunch of birds. Initially, they had been deputized as junior bird chasers, a role they took with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Did the consistent human pressure truly force them to seek easier pickings elsewhere, or were there other environmental shifts at play? Whatever the precise cause, the relentless, albeit unspectacular, efforts of Fotheringay-on-Wye eventually began to yield results. The granary, while still a target, suffered fewer major raids. The gardens, though never entirely bird-free, saw less devastation. The quiet whispers of resignation began to be replaced by cautious murmurs of hope. The turn of the tide was slow, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a testament to sheer, bloody-minded human perseverance against a feathered foe. But now, inspired by the mayor's brief disappearance and perhaps a growing understanding of the stakes, they began to embrace their role with newfound seriousness. They became keen observers, noting the birds' preferred entry points and patterns of movement. Young Timmy, the wormhole trap inventor, now spent his afternoons meticulously patching holes in netting and reporting any breaches to the pigeon patrol with the gravitas of a seasoned scout. Their small, but dedicated, efforts added a valuable layer to the town's defense. The shift wasn't dramatic, no sudden secret weapon or miraculous avian exodus. Instead, it was a gradual, almost imperceptible change in tactics and, more importantly, in attitude. Not the large, clumsy nets from earlier attempts, but fine, almost invisible mesh, meticulously draped over every fruit tree, every vegetable patch, and every open window. It was a laborious task, requiring hours of careful work, but it was surprisingly effective. The birds, for all their cunning, found it genuinely difficult to navigate these fine barriers, often becoming momentarily confused, allowing human residents a precious few moments of peace before the next attempted breach. You could almost hear their exasperated chirps as they bumped into the unseen obstacles. The townsfolk, having exhausted all their grand, outlandish schemes, began to focus on smaller, more persistent measures. They stopped trying to win a grand battle and started focusing on winning countless tiny skirmishes. It was a shift from aggressive offense to a more disciplined, unyielding defense. This kind of persistent, localized pressure is a mainstream historical fact in many long-term conflicts, where attrition and constant vigilance eventually wear down an adversary. One of the most effective, albeit tedious, new tactics involve the widespread deployment of simple netting. A quirky tidbit from this period involved the town's children. Historians still argue whether the birds eventually tired of the increased human resistance, or if their populations simply naturally declined due to factors unrelated to the conflict. With the tide slowly, almost imperceptibly, turning in their favor, the people of Fotheringay-on-Wye began to reflect on the long, peculiar conflict. The Great Sparrow War had been a harsh teacher, but it had imparted some invaluable lessons learned from the feathers. The birds never truly vanished. They simply became less of an overwhelming problem. The town learned that consistent, everyday effort, however small, was far more effective than sporadic, dramatic gestures. Whether it was meticulously re-netting a garden bed or simply remembering to close a chimney flue, these small acts, performed by everyone, added up to a formidable defense. Or, if environmental factors played a more significant role, did the town win the war, or did the war simply fade? Sparrows would still dart from underfoot, chasing after stray crumbs. But the overwhelming numbers were gone, and with them, the constant sense of siege. This wasn't, as the name might suggest, a culinary competition involving actual sparrows. Instead, it was a baking contest, where participants created elaborately decorated pies, often depicting humorous scenes from the Great Sparrow War. Some pies featured tiny, victorious humans with brooms, while others showed caricatures of bewildered birds. It was a rather charming, if slightly morbid, way of continuing to acknowledge their peculiar history. Old Mrs. Gable, ever the competitor, often made a pie with a single, defiant bird perched atop a miniature granary. The town had found a way to coexist, an uneasy truce, born not of negotiation, but of relentless human persistence and avian adaptation. Was it a retreat, or merely a tactical adjustment on their part? Whatever the precise ecological explanation, the lingering presence of the birds became a quiet, enduring symbol of the town's resilience. You, listening to this tale fade, can perhaps feel the peaceful rhythm of a town that has absorbed its unusual history, finding a gentle rhythm even with its persistent, feathered companions. This nuanced form of coexistence, where a former adversary remains present but no longer a primary threat, is a common outcome in many historical human-wildlife conflicts. A mainstream historical fact, often overlooked in favor of more dramatic narratives. Whatever the precise answer, the people of Fotheringay-on-Wye certainly felt a sense of quiet triumph. They'd still grumble about a bird leaving its mark on a freshly cleaned window, or a bold robin attempting to snatch a berry from a bush. But these were minor annoyances, not the existential threats they once were. The nets remained, a permanent fixture over gardens and open windows, a silent testament to lessons learned. You might notice locals automatically glancing upwards before leaving their homes, a habit ingrained during the darkest days of the war, now performed without a second thought. They had faced a unique challenge, endured incredible frustration, and emerged, if not victorious, then at least unbowed. You, listening to this tale of avian conflict, can appreciate the quiet fortitude required to simply keep going, day after day, against a persistent, feathered foe. This highlights a mainstream historical fact. Long-term societal challenges are often overcome not by singular heroic acts, but by sustained, collective effort. Instead, a lingering bird presence became an indelible part of the town's character. You see, the war didn't end with a grand treaty or a decisive victory parade. It simply faded into a more manageable, if still ever-present, background hum. The sounds of chirping and cooing, once a source of intense irritation, became something else entirely, a constant, gentle reminder of the town's unique history. You see, enduring such a persistent, unconventional threat changes a community, forging new strengths and revealing hidden reserves of resilience. It wasn't about grand victories, but about the quiet, stubborn art of not giving up. One of the most profound lessons was the sheer power of persistence. Another crucial lesson was adaptability. The townsfolk had initially approached the problem with conventional methods, then with increasingly outlandish ones. When these failed, they learned to observe, adapt, and refine their strategies. Children would gather around elders, listening to tales of brave encounters with a particularly large pigeon, or the day Mr. Henderson chased a magpie all the way down the high street. These stories, often embellished with gentle humor, served to codify the town's shared experience, turning their collective annoyance into a peculiar source of pride. The birds, in a strange way, had given them something unique to talk about for generations. They understood that their adversary was constantly evolving, and so must they. The birds taught them to think like birds, to anticipate their movements, and to understand their motivations. You can imagine the elderly Mrs. Gable no longer just shaking her fist at the sky, but calmly unfurling a new, tighter net over her petunias, a look of quiet determination on her face. A quirky tidbit from this reflective period was the emergence of bird war stories as a new form of local folklore. Historians still argue whether the ultimate decline in the bird's disruptive behavior was a direct result of human efforts. Even after the intense battles subsided and the town found its footing again, the birds of Fotheringay-on-Wye never truly vanished. Imagine walking through the market square now. You'd still see pigeons, of course, strutting about with that characteristic, self-important swagger. The residents of Fotheringay-on-Wye developed a new, almost unconscious relationship with their feathered neighbors. A quirky tidbit from this era of uneasy peace involves the town's annual sparrow pie contest. Historians still argue whether the reduction in bird activity was a result of sustained human pressure leading to a population decrease, or if the birds simply learned to forage more discreetly and avoid direct confrontation. The Great Sparrow War, for all its comical absurdity and genuine frustration, ultimately forged the unique identity of Fotheringay-on-Wye. The conflict, once a source of exasperation, transformed into a cherished, if peculiar, part of the town's narrative. There were bird-chasing relays, best-dressed scarecrow competitions, and the aforementioned sparrow pie bake-off. These traditions, born from genuine struggle, became sources of gentle humor and shared remembrance. They allowed the town to look back at a difficult period, not with bitterness, but with a quiet sense of accomplishment and a knowing chuckle. Did the war make them stronger as a collective, or simply more adept at dealing with minor nuisances? Whatever the scholarly interpretation, you can certainly appreciate how a series of utterly frustrating, mildly comical events could become the defining story of a place. The legacy of the Great Sparrow War wasn't about a grand triumph, but about the quiet, persistent spirit of a town that simply refused to be pecked into submission. This transformation of adversity into shared heritage is a mainstream historical fact seen in countless communities where collective memory shapes identity. It became the centerpiece of their local history, forever remembered as the legacy of the Great Sparrow War. You see, communities, much like individuals, are shaped by their trials. Before the war, it depicted a rather dull sheaf of wheat. After the war, it was subtly updated to include a small, stylized bird, not in a position of menace, but rather flying away, or perhaps perched politely on a branch, forever acknowledging their unique history. It was a quiet nod to the feathered adversaries who, inadvertently, had helped define them. And for this sleepy little town, it was the persistent pecking of thousands of birds that left the most indelible mark. Imagine the annual Fotheringay-on-Wye festival now. It wasn't just about turnips anymore. The war also instilled a newfound sense of community spirit and resilience. Having faced a common, relentless foe, the townsfolk learned to work together, to rely on one another, and to find strength in their collective efforts. The Pigeon Patrol, while no longer an active fighting force, continued as a social club, its members often gathering to reminisce about their feathered battles over a pint of ale. The bonds forged during those weary nights and frustrating days proved to be stronger than any bird droppings. A quirky tidbit that exemplifies this legacy is the Fotheringay-on-Wye town crest. Historians still argue whether the long-term impact of the bird war on Fotheringay-on-Wye was primarily psychological or practical. As the sun dips below the horizon, casting long, peaceful shadows over what was once a tumultuous battlefield of feathers and frustration, you can almost feel the quiet contentment settling over Fotheringay-on-Wye. The Great Sparrow War, once a source of daily exasperation, has long since receded into the gentle annals of memory, leaving behind a town that, perhaps ironically, finds a unique sort of peace in its very strange history. This is a town's sleepy remembrance, a quiet acknowledgement of the feathered challenge that once defined its days and nights, but a quiet testament to the enduring human spirit in the face of persistent, everyday annoyances. The soft rustle of leaves, the distant, murmuring calls of the night, a steady, rhythmic cadence. Imagine the quaint cottages, the peaceful river, and the enduring resilience of a community that found its quiet strength in the face of an unlikely, feathery foe. Let the images fade, the sounds soften, and the gentle humor of their tale ease you into a profound and peaceful rest. It's a reminder that even the smallest, most seemingly trivial challenges can bring out the best in us, forcing us to adapt, to innovate, and to find humor in the most unexpected places. The town, once plagued by feathers, now sleeps soundly, a gentle murmur of history, carried on the soft night air, telling tales of a time when the greatest threat was a very, very persistent bird. Imagine, now, the soft ambient sounds of the evening in no longer the frantic squawking and the desperate shouts, but the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant hoot of an owl, and perhaps, just perhaps, the quiet cooing of a few contented pigeons settling down for the night, a sound that no longer ignites panic, but merely a knowing, sleepy smile. The residents have learned to live alongside their feathered neighbors, an uneasy truce evolving into a comfortable, if sometimes still slightly annoying, coexistence. The daily routines, once punctuated by bird chasing, now flow with a tranquil rhythm, a testament to the town's enduring spirit. The occasional stray feather might drift onto your doorstep, or a distant chirp might momentarily stir a memory of frantic chases and comical traps. But these are fleeting thoughts, fading quickly into the comforting blanket of the present. The granary stands strong, its improved defenses a silent monument to resilience. The gardens, though still requiring a watchful eye, flourish. The sleep of Fotheringay-on-Wye is no longer broken by avian assaults, but by the natural ebb and flow of night, a hard-won peace earned through a most peculiar conflict. You can almost feel the collective sigh of relief, a gentle exhalation that has lasted for generations. The story of Fotheringay-on-Wye and its war against the birds is unto grand epic of heroes and villains. As you drift further into the quiet stillness of the night, let the gentle echoes of Fotheringay-on-Wye's peculiar past wash over you.